December 8, 1941 dawned with deceptive tranquility over Wake Island. A tiny coral atoll lost in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The previous day's news of Pearl Harbor had reached the island's defenders like a thunderclap, transforming their remote outpost from a sleepy construction site into America's newest front line. Major James Devereux stood on the beach, squinting at the horizon where sea met sky in an unbroken line, knowing that somewhere beyond that serene vista, an enemy armada was bearing down upon them. Wake Island measured barely 2.5 miles across at its widest point, a wishbone-shaped speck of coral and sand that had attracted American military attention only because of its strategic location. Positioned roughly 2,000 miles west of Hawaii, and over 1,000 miles from the nearest Japanese-held territory, the atoll served as a refueling stop for Pan American Airways Trans-Pacific Clipper service and, more recently, as a forward military installation under frantic construction. The island's garrison consisted of 449 United States Marines, 68 Navy personnel, and approximately 1,000 civilian contractors from Morrison Newts and Company, who had been building an airstrip and fortifications when war overtook them. Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham held overall command of the island's defense, though Major Devereux commanded the Marine Ground Forces. Between them, they possessed 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters from Marine Fighting Squadron 211, commanded by Major Paul Putnam, along with 6 5-inch coastal defense guns salvaged from old battleships, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and various smaller weapons. The defenders had established defensive positions around the atoll's 3 islands, Wake Proper, Peel, and Wilkes, connected by narrow causeways and united in their isolation. The civilians presented both an asset and a complication. These construction workers had come seeking adventure and generous wages in the Pacific's remote reaches, but they had not bargained on becoming combatants. Yet, as the certainty of attack crystallized, many volunteered to augment the military defenders. Don Teeters, a construction foreman from Idaho, organized groups of civilian workers into auxiliary units, handling ammunition, manning searchlights, and preparing to fight alongside the Marines if necessary. According to records preserved in Morrison Newts and Company archives and later documented in Gregory Irwin's comprehensive work, Facing Fearful Odds, these civilians would prove instrumental in the coming battle. The island's radar installation, one of the few operational in the Pacific at war's outbreak, swept the skies continuously. Lieutenant Kessler and his Navy radar crew maintained constant vigilance, knowing their equipment represented the defenders' eyes against an enemy that could strike from any direction. The 12 Wildcats sat dispersed around the airfield, though inadequate revetments left them vulnerable to attack. Ammunition stocks were adequate but not abundant, and the defenders possessed no torpedoes for potential naval engagements, relying entirely on their coastal guns to repel shipping. As darkness fell on that first night of America's war, the defenders of Wake Island settled into their positions, knowing sleep would become a precious commodity. The Marines checked their weapons repeatedly, while civilians moved supplies to forward positions. Nobody spoke of the odds they faced, but every man understood the mathematics of their situation. They were alone in the middle of the Pacific, with reinforcement impossible and retreat unthinkable, waiting for an enemy whose strength remained unknown but whose intentions were absolutely clear. December 11th, 1941 arrived with the shriek of aircraft engines and the whistle of falling bombs. At 11:58 in the morning, 27 twin-engine Japanese bombers from the Marshall Islands appeared over Wake Island, catching most of the Marine Wildcats on the ground during refueling operations. The raid lasted 13 devastating minutes that transformed the island's defensive capabilities and announced to the defenders the price they would pay for every hour they continued to resist. Major Paul Putnam watched helplessly as bombs rained down on his dispersed aircraft. The Japanese attackers, Mitsubishi G-3M Nell bombers from the 24th Air Flotilla, executed their mission with precision born from extensive training and recent combat experience in China. 8 of the 12 precious Wildcats exploded or burned where they sat, along with critical fuel supplies and aviation equipment. 23 Marine aviation personnel died in the attack, including several pilots who had rushed toward their aircraft in a futile attempt to get airborne. The survivors staggered through smoke and flames, trying to salvage what remained of their air defense capability. Captain Henry Elrod, one of the surviving pilots, helped organize the rescue of wounded men and the salvage of remaining aviation equipment. The 4 surviving Wildcats represented Wake's entire aerial defense force, and mechanics worked desperately to keep even these damaged aircraft operational. Ground crews cannibalized parts from destroyed planes, working through the night with minimal lighting to avoid attracting further attacks. The aviation gasoline situation had become critical, with most reserves destroyed in the bombing, meaning every flight would consume irreplaceable resources. The raid's psychological impact equaled its material destruction. The civilians, many of whom had never experienced combat, now understood viscerally what modern warfare meant. Some men broke under the strain, seeking shelter and refusing to emerge, but most channeled their fear into furious activity. Don Teeter's volunteer groups worked alongside Marines to improve defensive positions, dig deeper foxholes, and establish better camouflage for remaining equipment. The distinction between military and civilian began to blur as everyone recognized they shared the same fate. Major Devereux used the post-raid hours to refine his defensive dispositions. The island's geography dictated his options. Wake's southern shore presented the most likely invasion beaches, with relatively calmer waters and easier approaches than the windward northern coast. He concentrated his strongest positions there, placing 3 of his 5-inch guns to cover potential landing zones. Battery L, under Lieutenant Woodrow Kessler, occupied positions on Peacock Point at Wake's southern tip. Battery A, commanded by 1st Lieutenant Clarence Barninger, defended Wilkes Island's southern approach. Battery B, under 2nd Lieutenant John McAllister, covered Peel Island and the channel entrance. The 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, distributed around the atoll under Lieutenant William Lewis, now faced dual purposes. Originally intended purely for aircraft defense, they would also serve against landing craft if the Japanese attempted an amphibious assault. Machine gun positions dotted the likely invasion beaches, their fields of fire carefully calculated and rehearsed. The Marines had registered fire and coordinates for their weapons, establishing reference points so they could deliver accurate fire even in darkness. Commander Cunningham established his command post in a reinforced dugout near the airfield, maintaining communication with all defensive positions through a network of telephone lines that had been hastily buried to protect them from bombing. The communication system remained. Wake's critical vulnerability, severe damage, could isolate positions and prevent coordinated defense. Runners stood ready to carry messages if telephone lines failed, and simple signal systems using flares were established for emergency communications. As night fell on December 11th, every defender knew the bombing raid represented only the beginning. The Japanese would return, both from the air and across the water, and Wake's garrison would face the fundamental test of their courage, training, and will to resist. December 12th, 1941 began with the distant rumble of naval gunfire that echoed across Wake's coral foundations like approaching thunder. At 0300 hours, lookouts spotted dark shapes moving on the horizon, the silhouettes of warships approaching from the south. Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka commanded the Japanese invasion force: 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 patrol boats, and 2 medium transports carrying approximately 450 Special Naval Landing Force troops. The Admiral expected minimal resistance from Wake's defenders and anticipated occupying the atoll by nightfall. The Japanese plan relied on surprise and overwhelming firepower. At 0530 hours, the warships opened bombardment from approximately 6,000 yards offshore, shells screaming overhead to explode among the island's installations. The cruisers Yubari, Tenryu, and Tatsuta pumped 5.5-inch shells into Wake, while destroyers added their weapons to the bombardment. Explosions walked across the island as Japanese gunners searched for the American coastal batteries, whose positions remained unknown to the attackers. Major Devereux had issued strict orders: hold fire until the enemy ships closed to effective range. The 5-inch guns, vintage weapons from the First World War, lacked the range of modern naval rifles, but at close quarters they could prove deadly. Battery commanders watched through their telescopes as the Japanese warships maneuvered closer, their gun crews tense beside their weapons, fingers resting near firing lanyards. The discipline required to remain silent under bombardment tested every man's courage, but the Marines held their positions and their fire. At 06:15 hours, with the Japanese ships approximately 4,500 yards offshore and preparing to land their assault troops, Major Devereux gave the order that would transform the battle. "Commence firing," Lieutenant Barninger's battery. A on Wilkes Island opened first, its first salvo splashing near the destroyer Hayat. The second salvo struck home. The destroyer erupted in a massive explosion as shells penetrated her magazine, breaking her back. Hayat sank in 2 minutes, carrying most of her crew to the bottom, the first major Japanese warship lost in the Pacific War. This account of the destroyer's sinking appears in Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive naval history, History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, which documents how this single success electrified Wake's defenders and shocked the Japanese command. Battery L on Peacock Point engaged the light cruiser Yubari, Admiral Kagioka's flagship. Shells straddled the cruiser, sending geysers of seawater towering above her deck. One shell struck Yubari's superstructure, killing several officers and wounding others, throwing the invasion command into temporary confusion. The cruiser turned away, trailing smoke, her captain desperate to escape the unexpected hail of accurate fire. Battery B on Peel Island joined the action, targeting the destroyer Yayoi and scoring hits that left her burning and listing. Captain Henry Elrod and Captain Frank Theron lifted off in 2 of Wake's 4 remaining Wildcats, carrying 100-pound bombs jury-rigged to their wings. The pilots attacked through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black bursts, pressing their attacks with reckless courage. Elrod dove on the destroyer Kisaragi, releasing his bombs at minimum altitude. The destroyer exploded catastrophically, her own depth charges detonating in a chain reaction that obliterated the ship. More than 100 Japanese sailors perished in an instant. The transport ships, vulnerable and exposed, turned away from the shore under the combined artillery and air attack. Admiral Kagioka, wounded and with his flagship damaged, ordered a general withdrawal. By 0700 hours, the Japanese invasion force was retreating beyond gun range, leaving 2 sunken destroyers and approximately 500 dead sailors behind her. Stunning reversal for an enemy that had known only victory since the war's beginning. Commander Cunningham radioed Pearl Harbor with a message that would resonate across America. Enemy apparently retiring, Wake Island had accomplished what no other American force had yet achieved in the war. It had defeated a Japanese amphibious invasion. The tiny garrison's victory, though tactically modest, carried enormous psychological weight. In the dark early days of December 1941, when defeat followed defeat across the Pacific, Wake Island proved that Americans could fight, could win, and could make the enemy pay dearly for every yard of contested ground. December 13th through 22nd, 1941 saw Wake Island transformed from a forgotten atoll into a symbol of American resistance that captured the nation's imagination. Newspapers across the United States seized upon Wake's unlikely victory, crafting narratives of heroic defenders holding out against impossible odds. The defenders themselves, however, understood that their repulse of the first invasion had merely postponed the inevitable. The Japanese would return with greater force, and Wake's garrison grew weaker with each passing day. The Japanese bombers returned with vengeful regularity, sometimes twice daily, methodically destroying the island's facilities and grinding down its defenders. The raids followed predictable patterns that allowed the 4 remaining Wildcats to intercept occasionally, but the mathematical reality remained inescapable. Wake's tiny air force was being consumed by attrition. On December 13th, Captain Herb Freuler shot down 2 Japanese bombers before his own aircraft took damage that barely allowed him to land. The mechanics performed miracles, keeping any planes operational, scavenging parts and improvising repairs with whatever materials they could find. Major Paul Putnam's pilots flew missions that bordered on suicide. With no replacement aircraft, no spare parts beyond what could be cannibalized, and diminishing fuel stocks, every takeoff carried the knowledge that each flight brought the squadron closer to extinction. Yet the pilots continued flying, knowing their presence complicated Japanese attack planning and provided psychological support to the ground defenders. Captain Henry Ilrod, who had sunk the destroyer Siashragi, flew mission after mission despite exhaustion and minor wounds, his aggressive spirit inspiring the entire garrison. The civilian workers had by now fully integrated into the defense. Don Teeter's volunteers manned ammunition parties, transported supplies during bombardments, and maintained the vital infrastructure that kept the garrison functioning. Some civilians took up arms directly, serving machine guns and artillery pieces alongside Marines who gratefully accepted their assistance. The Morrison-Knudsen compound became an auxiliary strongpoint, with civilians converting construction equipment into improvised weapons and fortifications. Bulldozers created additional defensive positions, while trucks moved supplies under cover of darkness. Major Devereux used the respite to improve Wake's defenses, though he knew time worked against him. The Marines deepened foxholes, improved camouflage, and positioned ammunition caches to ensure each defensive position could sustain itself if isolated. The Major personally visited every position, checking preparations and bolstering morale through his calm, methodical presence. His Marines responded to his leadership, maintaining discipline despite deteriorating conditions and growing casualties. Communication with Pearl Harbor remained sporadic but sustained hope. Commander Cunningham filed regular reports on the garrison's status, ammunition expenditure, casualties, and desperately needed supplies. He requested reinforcements, additional aircraft, spare parts, ammunition, and medical supplies. Pearl Harbor's responses remained encouraging but vague, promising relief without specifying when it might arrive. The defenders clung to these promises, believing that America would not abandon its defenders to their fate. The psychological strain of sustained siege began manifesting in various ways. Some men became withdrawn and fatalistic, going through their duties mechanically. Others grew hyperactive and aggressive, seeking action to relieve tension. Major Devereux and his officers worked to maintain unit cohesion, organizing rotations that allowed men brief rest periods away from the most exposed positions. The medical staff, led by Navy Dr. Gustav Kahn and Marine Lieutenant Commander Lawton Schenck, treated a growing number of casualties from bombing raids while preparing for the inevitable wounded from a ground assault. Sleep deprivation eroded everyone's efficiency. The constant threat of air raids, the need to maintain 24-hour vigilance, and the tension of waiting for the next attack prevented proper rest. Men caught sleep in brief snatches, often in their fighting positions, waking to the sound of aircraft engines or artillery fire. Coffee and willpower sustained the defenders as physical reserves dwindled. By December 22nd, Wake Island's garrison had survived 2 weeks of sustained attack. They had shot down several Japanese aircraft, damaged numerous ships, and killed hundreds of enemy soldiers and sailors. But the cost had been high casualties mounted daily, ammunition stocks declined toward critical levels, and the 4 Wildcats were reduced to 2 marginally operational aircraft. The defenders knew their epic stand approached its climax, and each man wondered whether relief would arrive before the Japanese returned in overwhelming force. December 23, 1941 arrived with ominous darkness as storm clouds obscured the moon over Wake Island. At 0100 hours, radar operator Private First Class Robert Bryan detected multiple contacts approaching from the northwest, a massive force that dwarfed the initial invasion fleet. Admiral Kajioka had returned, but this time with overwhelming strength. The second invasion force included 4 heavy cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers providing air cover, numerous destroyers, and transports carrying over 1,000 Special Naval Landing Force troops. The Admiral had orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters to erase the humiliation of December 11th, regardless of cost. The Japanese had learned from their first failure. This attack would come under cover of darkness, supported by carrier aircraft at dawn, and executed with sufficient force to overwhelm Wake's defenses through sheer weight of numbers. 2 battalions of elite naval infantry would land simultaneously at multiple points, fragmenting the defense and preventing concentrated resistance. The carriers Soryu and Hiryu, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, would provide air superiority and close support, their aircraft ready to destroy any target the invasion force encountered. Major Devereux received reports of the approaching fleet and activated Wake's final defense plan. Every man moved to his assigned position, including civilians who had volunteered for combat roles. The Marines checked their weapons one final time, distributed remaining ammunition, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. They knew reinforcement would not arrive in time if it came at all. The atoll's defenders now numbered fewer than 400 combatants, facing an invasion force 3 times their size, supported by naval gunfire and carrier aviation. At 0000 hours, Japanese destroyers closed to point-blank range and opened fire, their shells systematically destroying communication lines, observation posts, and defensive positions. The barrage exceeded the first invasion's bombardment in intensity and accuracy, reflecting improved intelligence about American positions. Battery positions that had remained hidden during the first attack now came under concentrated fire. Lieutenant Barninger's Battery A on Wilkes Island suffered direct hits that killed several crewmen and damaged 1 gun. Battery L on Peacock Point endured sustained fire that gradually reduced its effectiveness. Under cover of the bombardment, Japanese landing craft approached multiple beaches simultaneously. The Special Naval Landing Force troops were Japan's equivalent to Marines elite, extensively trained amphibious infantry who had proven their capability in China. They came ashore at Wilkes Island, along Wake's southern shore and near the airfield, their multiple landing points forcing Major Devereux to divide his already outnumbered force. Captain Wesley Platt commanded the defensive sector on Wilkes Island, where Japanese troops first gained a foothold. His Marines poured rifle and machine gun fire into the landing craft, killing dozens of attackers before they reached shore. But more landing craft kept coming, disgorging troops who established beachheads and began advancing inland. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along the beach as Marines fought to contain the penetrations. The battle became a savage, close-quarter struggle conducted in darkness, lit by muzzle flashes and exploding grenades. Captain Elrod, the pilot who had sunk a destroyer, now fought as an infantry officer after Wake's last aircraft had been destroyed. He led a counterattack against Japanese troops threatening to overrun a key defensive position, his aggressive tactics momentarily halting the enemy advance. In the confused fighting, Elrod killed multiple enemy soldiers before Japanese fire brought him down. He would later be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Marine aviator so recognized in World War II. On Wake proper, Japanese troops pressed toward the airfield against desperate Marine resistance. Major Putnam organized his remaining aviation personnel into a makeshift infantry unit, defending their positions with rifles and whatever weapons they could find. These men, trained as pilots and mechanics rather than ground combatants, fought with ferocious determination against professional infantry. The battle surged back and forth across the airfield, neither side able to gain decisive advantage in the darkness. Commander Cunningham, from his command post, attempted to coordinate the defense despite severed communications. Runners brought fragmentary reports of Japanese landings at multiple points, overwhelming defensive positions, and mounting casualties. The commander faced the terrible calculus of command. His garrison was being destroyed piecemeal, with no possibility of victory and no hope of escape. Yet he hesitated to order surrender while his men still fought, knowing that every additional hour of resistance served some larger purpose in the war's grand strategy, even if Wake itself was doomed. December 23, 1941 continued its bloody course as dawn approached and Wake Island's defenders fought isolated battles across the atoll. The Japanese advance, though costly, proved inexorable as superior numbers and sustained naval gunfire gradually overwhelmed defensive positions. By 0400 hours, Japanese troops controlled most of Wilkes Island and had established strong positions along Wake's southern shore. Marine defensive sectors had been reduced to disconnected pockets of resistance, each fighting its own desperate battle with diminishing ammunition and mounting casualties. Major James Devereux moved between positions, attempting to establish a coherent defensive line from the fragmentary forces still under his control. The Major led counterattacks personally, his presence inspiring Marines to extraordinary efforts. At one position, he found 6 Marines holding off an entire Japanese platoon, their machine gun firing until its barrel glowed red in the pre-dawn darkness. When the gun finally jammed from overheating, the Marines fixed bayonets and charged the advancing enemy in a desperate attempt to buy time for comrades to withdraw. On Peel Island, Lieutenant Arthur Poindexter's small garrison found itself isolated and surrounded as Japanese forces cut them off from Wake proper. Rather than surrender, Poindexter organized a breakout attempt, leading his men in a fighting withdrawal toward friendly lines. The lieutenant was hit multiple times during the movement but refused evacuation, continuing to direct his men until he collapsed from blood loss. His Marines carried him with them, refusing to abandon their commander even as Japanese fire pursued them across open ground. The civilian volunteers fought alongside Marines with a courage born from knowledge that the Japanese granted no special consideration to non-combatants. Don Teeters, the construction foreman who had organized civilian resistance, was killed by naval gunfire while leading an ammunition resupply party to a hard-pressed defensive position. Other civilians continued his work, maintaining the flow of supplies that kept scattered positions fighting despite their isolation. Some civilians who had no combat role worked to evacuate and treat wounded men, establishing an impromptu aid station that operated under constant fire. Dr. Gustav Kahn and his medical staff performed heroic work under impossible conditions. The aid station overflowed with wounded men, their numbers exceeding available supplies and the doctor's capacity to treat them all. Kahn moved among his patients, triaging injuries and providing what treatment he could with diminishing medical supplies. The doctor worked through exhaustion and despair, knowing that many men he might have saved under normal conditions would die for lack of basic supplies. Commander Cunningham faced the decision he had desperately hoped to avoid. Reports from all sectors painted the same picture: defensive positions collapsing, casualties mounting unsustainably, ammunition nearly exhausted, and Japanese reinforcements continuing to land. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Continued resistance would result in complete annihilation of the garrison without meaningful military purpose. At 0500 hours, with dawn breaking over a battle that had raged for 4 hours, Cunningham made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered Major Devereux to arrange surrender terms with the Japanese commander. Major Devereux received the order with anguish but understanding. He knew his Marines would fight until killed to the last man if so ordered, but he also recognized that such sacrifice would serve no strategic purpose. The Major dispatched messengers to surviving defensive positions with orders to cease fire and display white flags. Some Marines initially refused to believe the order, convinced it must be Japanese deception. Officers had to personally visit positions to confirm that the surrender was genuine and authorized. The process of surrender proved chaotic and dangerous. Not all positions received the order simultaneously, and some Marines continued fighting for hours after the general ceasefire, unaware that organized resistance had ended. Japanese troops, their blood up from the fierce fighting, sometimes ignored white flags and continued attacking. Several Americans were killed after the surrender order, victims of the fog of war and the difficulty of stopping a battle once fully engaged. As morning sunlight spread across Wake Island on December 23, 1941, Japanese troops gradually gained control of the atoll. The surviving defenders, fewer than 200 Marines, sailors, and armed civilians, were assembled under guard, their uniforms torn and blood-stained, their faces showing exhaustion and shock. They had fought against overwhelming odds for 15 days, achieved the first American victory of the war, and held out longer than anyone had believed possible. Now they stood defeated but unbroken, having written a chapter of military history that would inspire their nation through the dark years ahead. The exact number of American casualties remained uncertain in the battle's immediate aftermath, but approximately 120 defenders had been killed, with many more wounded. Japanese losses far exceeded American. Over 800 Japanese soldiers and sailors died taking Wake Island, a casualty ratio that would prove characteristic of Pacific Island fighting throughout the war. The defenders had inflicted damage out of all proportion to their numbers, validating the fighting quality of American forces even in defeat. December 23, 1941's afternoon brought the full reality of surrender to Wake Island's survivors as Japanese troops organized their captives and began the process of occupation. The defenders, exhausted from 15 days of siege and a night of desperate combat, now faced an uncertain future as prisoners of war. Lieutenant Commander Cunningham, Major Devereux, and the other officers maintained discipline among the survivors, insisting on military bearing despite defeat. This dignity in captivity would characterize the Wake defenders throughout their long imprisonment. The Japanese victors treated their captives with a mixture of respect for brave adversaries and contempt for men who had surrendered rather than fight to death. Some Japanese officers expressed admiration for the Americans' defense, particularly the December 11th repulse of the first invasion. Others exhibited brutality that foreshadowed the harsh treatment Wake's defenders would endure in the years ahead. The immediate hours after surrender proved chaotic and dangerous, as individual Japanese soldiers sought revenge for fallen comrades, or simply expressed their contempt for prisoners through violence and humiliation. Approximately 1,100 Americans became prisoners on Wake Island, the 400-plus military defenders supplemented by roughly 670 civilian contractors who had remained on the island throughout the battle. The Japanese faced an immediate logistical challenge. What to do with this unexpected mass of prisoners in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from established prison camps? The solution would prove characteristic of Japanese prisoner handling throughout the war: improvised, harsh, and indifferent to captive welfare. The prisoners were initially held in the open, without shelter, adequate water, or sufficient food. December's tropical sun beat down on men already weakened by weeks of short rations and sustained combat. Guards prevented prisoners from seeking shade or moving about freely, enforcing discipline through rifle butts and bayonet threats. The wounded received minimal medical attention, and several men died from injuries that proper treatment might have saved. Dr. Khan continued working on behalf of his fellow prisoners, advocating for medical supplies and better treatment with limited success. On January 10, 1942, approximately 470 military prisoners and civilian construction workers were loaded aboard Japanese transport ships for transfer to prisoner of war camps in Asia. The conditions aboard these ships previewed the horrors that awaited prisoners in Japanese hands. Men were crowded into cargo holds with inadequate ventilation, minimal food and water, and no sanitary facilities. The voyage to Shanghai took 2 weeks of misery, with several prisoners dying en route from disease, dehydration, or mistreatment. Approximately 1,198 civilian contractors remained on Wake Island, pressed into forced labor by the Japanese to repair battle damage and improve fortifications. These men endured 2 years of harsh captivity on Wake itself, working under brutal conditions with inadequate food and medical care. Their story would end in tragedy in October 1943, when the Japanese garrison commander, fearing an American invasion, ordered 98 of the remaining civilian prisoners executed. This atrocity, discovered after the war, resulted in the commander's trial and execution as a war criminal. The military prisoners began an odyssey through the Japanese prison camp system that would last until August 1945. Commander Cunningham, Major Devereux, and other officers were eventually separated from their men and sent to special camps for high-ranking prisoners. The enlisted Marines and sailors moved through a succession of camps in China, Japan, and other occupied territories, enduring starvation rations, forced labor, disease, and systematic brutality. Of the approximately 470 military prisoners transported from Wake, more than 100 died in captivity from malnutrition, disease, or outright murder. The prisoners maintained their discipline and military organization throughout captivity, a testament to the leadership of their officers and their own resilience. Secret communication networks connected prisoners across camps, maintaining unit cohesion and providing mutual support. Senior officers like Cunningham and Devereux established clandestine command structures, issued orders, and maintained military standards despite Japanese attempts to break prisoner morale and organization. News of Wake Island's defense reached the American mainland in fragmentary form during late December 1941. Military censors released limited information about the battle, balancing the need to maintain morale through stories of heroic resistance against concerns about revealing military capabilities or raising false hopes about garrison relief. Newspapers seized upon Wake's resistance as a bright spot in the catastrophic early weeks of the Pacific War. Headlines proclaimed, "Wake Island still holding out," and "Marines defy Japs at Wake." crafting a narrative of defiant resistance that captured public imagination. The surrender, when announced, brought disappointment but did not diminish public admiration for Wake's defenders. The garrison had held out for 15 days against overwhelming odds, achieved the war's first American victory by repelling the December 11th invasion, and extracted a heavy price from the enemy before finally succumbing to superior force. Their example provided inspiration during the dark early months of 1942, when American forces retreated across the Pacific and defeat followed defeat. The liberation of Wake Island's surviving prisoners beginning in August 1945 brought to light the full extent of their ordeal and sacrifice. Commander Cunningham, Major Devereux, and approximately 360 military survivors endured until Japan's surrender, though their bodies bore permanent marks from years of starvation, disease, and abuse. The discovery of the October 1943 massacre of 98 civilian prisoners added a dark epilogue to Wake's story, transforming the battle's memory from one of brave defense to encompassing both heroic resistance and war crime victimhood. Major James Devereux returned to the United States as a public hero, his leadership during the siege widely celebrated. He later served in the United States House of Representatives, representing Maryland's 2nd District from 1951 to 1959. Throughout his political career, Devereux remained modest about his wartime role, crediting his Marines and the civilian volunteers for Wake's defense. His memoir, published in 1947, provided a detailed account of the siege that became the authoritative defender's perspective on the battle. Commander Winfield Cunningham also returned, though his post-war life proved more complicated. Questions arose about certain command decisions, particularly concerning the surrender timing, though subsequent analysis vindicated his judgment that further resistance would have resulted in garrison annihilation without strategic benefit. Cunningham retired from the Navy in 1950, having served with distinction through the remainder of the war after his repatriation. The Wake Island legend grew in the telling, acquiring mythological elements that sometimes obscured historical reality. The most famous example involved the apocryphal message, "Send us more Japs," which supposedly came from Wake's defenders in response to headquarters' inquiry about needed supplies. This colorful but invented communication became part of Wake's folklore, repeated in countless retellings despite being historically baseless. The real messages from Wake were more prosaic, but no less significant straightforward reports of tactical situations, supply needs, and casualty figures that painted a picture of determined professional resistance rather than flamboyant heroics. The strategic significance of Wake Island's defense extended beyond the tactical battle results. The garrison's resistance, particularly the December 11th repulse of the first invasion, forced the Japanese to divert significant resources to retake a tiny atoll that might otherwise have fallen quickly. The 2 weeks Wake held out allowed American commanders to better organize defenses elsewhere in the Pacific, evacuate personnel from threatened positions, and begin planning the long counteroffensive that would eventually drive Japan back across the ocean. Every day, Wake held represented time purchased for American mobilization. The psychological impact on both American and Japanese forces proved equally important. For Americans, Wake demonstrated that Japanese forces were not invincible, that properly trained and led American troops could defeat enemy attacks, and that individual courage and sacrifice could alter military outcomes. For the Japanese, Wake revealed that their opponents would fight with determination and skill, that American forces possessed weapons and tactics capable of inflicting serious damage, and that the Pacific War would not be the easy triumph their early successes suggested. The battle's tactical lessons influenced American military doctrine throughout the war. Wake demonstrated the importance of coastal artillery, dispersed defensive positions, aggressive leadership, and integrated civilian military defense. The effectiveness of Wake's 4 Wildcat fighters against numerically superior Japanese attackers informed carrier aviation tactics. The garrison's radio communications and intelligence gathering provided valuable information about Japanese operational methods. Military analysts studied Wake's defense in detail, extracting principles that were applied to subsequent island battles across the Pacific. Wake Island remained in Japanese hands until September 1945, when the garrison surrendered following Japan's capitulation. American forces reoccupied the atoll, discovering the evidence of the civilian prisoners' massacre and beginning the process of identifying remains and documenting Japanese war crimes. The island returned to its pre-war role as an airfield and refueling station, though now operated by the United States Air Force rather than civilian airlines. Memorials to Wake's defenders were erected across the United States, ensuring their sacrifice would be remembered by future generations. The Marine Corps established the Wake Island Device, a special decoration awarded to personnel who participated in the battle. Individual decorations recognized Extraordinary Valor Captain Elrod's posthumous Medal of Honor, numerous Navy Crosses, and other awards that acknowledged the garrison's collective heroism. The Battle of Wake Island earned its place in the pantheon of American military history, not because it changed the war's outcome, the garrison's defeat was inevitable, but because it demonstrated qualities essential to eventual victory: courage under impossible odds, innovative tactical thinking, leadership that inspired extraordinary performance, and refusal to surrender until resistance became physically impossible. These characteristics, displayed by 449 Marines, 68 sailors, and over 1,000 civilian volunteers on a coral atoll barely visible on Pacific maps, helped define the American military tradition and inspired generations of service members who followed. The passage of decades since December 1941 has not diminished Wake Island's significance in American military memory. The battle occupies a unique position in the Pacific War's history, neither a victory like Midway that changed the conflict's trajectory, nor a defeat like Bataan whose strategic importance altered Allied planning, but rather a small, doomed defense that nonetheless captured essential truths about courage, sacrifice, and the mathematics of modern warfare. Understanding why Wake matters requires examining both what happened on that tiny atoll and what those events represented to a nation suddenly thrust into global war. The demographics of Wake's defenders reflected America's military in December 1941, largely young men from small towns and cities across the nation, many serving their first combat deployment, led by professional officers and non-commissioned officers who had prepared for war without knowing when or where it would come. The Marines came from recruiting depots in San Diego, Parris Island, and Quantico, carrying traditions dating to the Continental Marines of 1775. The Navy personnel represented both the technical specialists of modern warfare, radar operators, communicators, medical personnel, and the traditional seagoing sailors. The civilians embodied American entrepreneurial spirit, having traveled thousands of miles seeking opportunity in the Pacific's remote reaches. This diverse group, thrown together by circumstance on an obscure atoll, formed a cohesive fighting force that exceeded the sum of its parts. The integration of civilian volunteers into military defensive structures happened organically, without formal authorization or bureaucratic approval, driven by recognition of shared fate and mutual respect. This improvised cooperation between military professionals and civilian workers established patterns that would recur throughout the war, from Bataan's defense to the Seabees formation to civilian merchant marine service on dangerous convoy routes. The sacrifice of Wake's defenders brought tangible benefits for American war efforts, despite the battle's ultimate outcome. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed over Wake was one fewer aircraft available for operations elsewhere. Every day the garrison held represented time for American commanders to evacuate vulnerable positions, strengthen defenses at critical locations, and organize resources for the long war ahead. The damage inflicted on Japanese naval forces: 2 destroyers sunk, multiple ships damaged, hundreds of sailors killed represented losses Japan could ill afford in the war's opening weeks when numerical advantage remained limited. More importantly, Wake's resistance demonstrated to Allied commanders and troops worldwide that American forces could fight effectively against Japanese attacks. In December 1941, with Pearl Harbor destroyed, Philippines under invasion, Guam captured, and British forces retreating across Malaya, American military prestige stood at its nadir. Wake's success in repelling the December 11th invasion, modest though it was in absolute terms, proved that Japanese forces were not supermen, that American weapons and tactics could succeed, and that properly lead American troops would fight with determination. This psychological boost, though difficult to quantify, contributed to maintaining morale during the war's darkest early months. The treatment of Wake's prisoners during their captivity highlighted the fundamental differences in military culture between American and Japanese forces. American military tradition, descended from European practices and codified in international conventions, held that soldiers who surrendered honorably after exhausting means of resistance deserved humane treatment. Japanese military tradition, rooted in Bushido concepts that valued death over surrender, regarded prisoners with contempt as men who had forfeited honor by choosing captivity over battlefield death. This cultural gulf produced the systematic mistreatment, starvation, forced labor, and outright murder that characterized Japanese prisoner handling throughout the war. The survival of most Wake defenders through nearly 4 years of captivity testified to their resilience and the strength of military community bonds. Prisoners supported one another, shared scarce resources, maintained discipline despite Japanese efforts to break unit cohesion, and preserved their humanity despite dehumanizing conditions. Officers like Cunningham and Devereux provided leadership even in captivity, maintaining order and military standards that helped prisoners psychologically survive their ordeal. The approximately 100 military prisoners who died in captivity represented a terrible loss, but the survival of more than 250 others through conditions designed to kill them demonstrated extraordinary individual and collective strength. Contemporary military forces continue studying Wake Island's defense, extracting lessons applicable to modern warfare. The battle illustrated principles of defensive operations, the importance of aggressive leadership, maintaining unit cohesion under pressure, maximizing available resources through innovation, integrating all available personnel into defensive efforts, and maintaining resistance until physically impossible. These principles transcend specific weapon systems or tactical situations, remaining relevant across changing technological landscapes. Wake Island today serves as a wildlife refuge administered by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, with limited military presence maintaining airfield facilities used for emergency landings and occasional military operations. The atoll's remoteness, which made relief impossible in December 1941, now protects it from development pressure and allows native species to flourish. Visitors remain rare, though occasional military groups and history enthusiasts make the difficult journey to walk the beaches where Marines fought in 1941. Memorials on Wake commemorate the battle, identifying key defensive positions, honoring fallen defenders, and explaining the siege's progression. The most poignant memorial marks the site where the 98 civilian prisoners were executed in October 1943, ensuring this atrocity remains part of Wake's historical memory. These memorials serve as tangible connections to events now 8 decades past, anchoring abstract historical knowledge in physical geography where actual men fought, died, and demonstrated that courage and sacrifice retain meaning even in hopeless situations. The Battle of Wake Island endures in American memory because it exemplifies qualities Americans wish to believe characterized their military forces' determination against overwhelming odds, innovative problem-solving under pressure, integration of diverse individuals into effective teams, and willingness to sacrifice for larger purposes. Whether these qualities are uniquely American is debatable, but their display on Wake Island in December 1941 provided inspiration when Americans desperately needed examples of courage and competence. That inspiration remains valuable, reminding subsequent generations that ordinary people, when properly led and motivated, prove capable of extraordinary actions that transcend immediate tactical results to achieve enduring significance in national memory and identity.